Hello and welcome back to NewsX World. I'm Thomas Porteous and you're watching Focal Length, where we get you a briefing on topics from across the world. Australia is at a critical moment for public safety and national security. Following the deadly Bondi shooting, the Albanese government has announced a nationwide gun buyback scheme, the largest since the 1996 Port Arthur massacre. The programme will buy back banned and illegal firearms, introduce limits on ownership, tighten licensing rules and further restrict certain gun types, with costs shared between the federal government and the states. But as the debate intensifies, questions remain. Is gun control enough in an era of online radicalisation, lone actor violence and digital extremism? And how should Australia balance civil liberties, technology and security? To discuss this, we are joined by Robert Potter, CEO of Internet 2.0, based in the Australian capital of Canberra. He is a visiting fellow at the Australian National University's College of Arts and Social Sciences and has led cybersecurity initiatives across Latin America, the Middle East and the Asia Pacific on behalf of the US State Department. Robert Potter is a leading voice on security, online extremism and digital threat mitigation. Thank you very much for joining us, Robert, here on Focal Length. It is a pleasure to have you. Of course, let's get straight into this. Following the Bondi Beach attack, the Albanese government has announced a gun buyback scheme after the tragedy that occurred just a week ago now, and drawing criticism both inside and outside of the government. What is your assessment of the Albanese government's move here?
Well, the number of guns in Australia has been going up since the last gun buyback in the 90s. So there's a lot of good arguments for a new gun buyback to reduce the number of guns in circulation in Australia. I think it makes sense to do that. I think the criticism that it's getting is that it probably isn't going to solve the underlying problem with radicalisation in Australia. So presenting it as the only solution would be a mistake, but I certainly see buying back guns in Australia to be a reasonable measure that should be taken at the moment.
And moving on, what does this programme mean for civilians across Australia, and how are people on the ground reacting to it?
I think it's only going to impact a very few number of people. Australia already has very low rates of gun ownership, and per capita, so that is the number of guns divided by the number of people in Australia, the number of guns in Australia since 1996 is actually much lower now. So gun ownership is already very small, but getting guns off the street and reducing that number further is going to be an absolute benefit overall to safety in Australia. But I think the average person on the street isn't just calling for this problem to be fixed. They want to feel safe when they go to the beach. They want to feel safe when they're going to a synagogue or when they're going to church or going to a Christmas event. And there is this overarching fear of terrorism at the moment because the threat is real, and just taking guns off people isn't in itself going to fix that problem.
Robert, this is the largest gun buyback since the 1996 Port Arthur massacre, which saw 35 people killed and 23 injured, which triggered a massive national gun buyback of over 650,000 firearms being destroyed. However, how will today's programme differ from the one implemented 30 years ago, especially in a far more digitalised society? And what lessons still apply now?
Yeah, it means that opposition to it is going to be different this time. I think opposition is going to be more online. It's going to have a lot more international voices on it. Whenever we talk about domestic politics in Australia, the entire world seems to be commenting on it. So when you go and look at the debates online at the moment, they're different online to what I'm seeing in the streets, because every American with a Twitter account seems to have a strong opinion on Australia's gun laws. They all seem to they seem to have us not want to do any gun control in our country. So they have this massive pressure on us through comments from Americans who like their guns, who seem to be really struggling to understand why Australia takes a different point of view on gun ownership. So I think what's going to happen is there's going to be more external voices outside of Australia trying to get into our debate internally. I think it being the biggest, that makes sense. Like we shouldn't be doing these things all the time, but getting the number of guns in circulation down is a good thing. But I would expect this to be a much more vicious debate than it was last time. And it's not just going to be an Australian debate, because every foreigner is going to have an opinion on this as well.
Now, the government says the cost will be shared equally between the federal government and the states and territories. What precedent does this funding model set, and how might it impact state-level law enforcement?
All right, that's a really good question. So in Australia, we already have a lot of federal policies that are jointly funded. So health and education are all already funded by both the states and the federal government. Disability funding is already done jointly between both the state and federal government. Where I think this is going to have a major impact is locally, if other states don't all want to go along with the ride. So New South Wales and Victoria, yes, I think are going to go aboard with this, South Australia, but it's not necessarily the case that every state in Australia is going to have the same equal level of passion for implementing the policy. So I think the drawback is getting consensus across all the states and territories, where not all of the governments have the same point of view on gun control, even if they all generally agree that fewer guns in Australia is a good thing. So I expect this to be harder to do when it's done jointly.
Now, critics argue that focusing on gun control risks diverting attention from deeper issues like online radicalisation and intelligence failures. How should the government balance these priorities?
That's a really good question. I think that's fair criticism. I think treating gun control as the main solution to this isn't going to fix it, because we have terrorism in Australia with legal guns. We have terrorism in Australia with knives. We've had to install barriers all over our cities so that people don't drive us over with their cars. So guns are not the only way that Australians can be victims of terrorism. And there was a bomb in the car at Bondi Beach that had to be defused separately. So guns weren't even the only way that these gentlemen were planning to kill Australians. So treating it as a simple gun issue is not going to be satisfactory to the average voter. And I suspect that there are underlying issues with radicalisation. There are underlying issues with people joining terror groups. For example, the population of Lakemba in Western Sydney, which is heavily Muslim in orientation, during the 2010s was more likely to provide a volunteer to the Islamic State than it was to join the police force or the Australian Defence Force. So those are huge issues with citizenship. And that's a massive discussion, and it's a harder discussion for Australia to have about what expectations we have on one another around citizenship. And so what I think we're going to have is a government that will attempt to solve things where there's an easy consensus, like gun control, but these harder conversations about radicalisation, we can't afford to put those off. And I think voters will penalise a government if they do try and not address these issues fully.
Now, going back to the attack, it's been described as a terrorist incident, of course, with alleged links to the extremist Islamic State ideology. What does this reveal about Australia's current threat landscape?
So it shows that Australia is not alone. Every country in the world has been subject to terrorism in some form or another. There was definitely a link to extremist ideology. The guys brought a terrorist flag with them to the attack. They put it in the window of their car when they did it. I think it's pretty obvious that these guys were pledged their loyalty to the Islamic State. it shows that there is an ongoing terrorism threat in Australia that relates to radical Islam. We also have other threats in Australia as well. And the problem we have is that our intelligence agencies domestically are already struggling to meet their objectives in other areas. I'll give you an example of what I mean by that. So China, for example, has deployed a huge number of consular officials, so diplomatic people to Australia, that has already changed the huge amount of resource drain on our intelligence agencies around counterintelligence. So we have to balance this massive requirement to invest in counterintelligence with this ongoing requirement to invest in counterterrorism. So this is really straining the resources of our intelligence agencies, because doing counterterrorism is a completely different mission to doing counterintelligence work. And the same agency has to split its budget against an increasingly dangerous global environment around counterintelligence, around great power rivalries of China and Russia and all the things that are happening in the world, with this threat of ongoing extremist terrorism. And so we don't quite have that balance right yet. And it shows that the threat landscape in Australia is ongoing and isn't going away anytime soon. And we need to make a real investment into our services so that they're able to meet the needs of the future and not just have to plug these gaps of trying to make sure that we're not being exploited and undermined by China, while also keeping Australian citizens safe from terrorism.
Australia has recently recognised a Palestinian state, something which Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu blamed for this attack. It is, however, also seen a rise in anti-Semitic incidents since October the 7th in particular, including attacks on Jewish institutions and schools. What do you think the Australian government is doing to tackle these activities, and what better could have been done?
I think Australia is dramatically under supporting our Jewish community. The Jewish community has been screaming out for support from the Australian government. We've had ongoing protests that have specifically targeted Jewish schools, Jewish synagogues, and Jewish shops. We've had extremist language that's insanely anti-Semitic at rallies that are supposedly about the Palestine issue. So we've had this inability of the Palestine debate in Australia to make a distinguish between Jews in Australia and the state of Israel. And they've constantly targeted the domestic Jewish community in Australia. That lack of firewall in those protests has increased the risk to the Jewish population in Australia. My Jewish friends are increasingly living in their homes behind armed guards, in their schools behind armed guards. No community in Australia should have to live like that. That's just totally unfair. And the Australian government needs to react in a way that responsibly calls people to account for this sort of increasing threat behaviour. And it's not just to the Jewish community, because what starts with the Jewish community never stops with the Jewish community. These sorts of attacks, once we normalise racism against one group in Australia, we normalise it against all groups in Australia. And this sort of extremist ideology, which seeks to import foreign wars into Australian politics, needs to be fundamentally rejected. We've always had a very successful multicultural society. Indian Australians, Pakistani Australians have been able to live at peace with one another in Australia without bashing each other in the streets of Sydney over their different views over what should happen in Kashmir. We should have exactly the same expectation when it comes to people who support Palestine who come to Australia. We have the same expectation on Russians and Ukrainians in Australia. You don't see them bombing each other on the streets of Australia. It's only on this issue where people feel comfortable bringing the war home that really, really annoys Australians. Central to our multicultural identity is that when you come to Australia and you become Australian, you leave the war behind, and we don't import that into our country. And I think the fact that we've seen that happen here has got everyone really concerned.
And finally, Robert, what concrete steps must now be taken legally, socially, and technologically to ensure an attack like this does not happen again?
So I think there's a lot that needs to happen, particularly around de-radicalisation. We've normalised a lot of hate in Australia. We've had protests in Australia where Islamic State flags have been there. And we've had jihadi recruiters show up at rallies. That has to stop. All right, there's absolutely space for peaceful protest in Australia and freedom of speech. But when the rallies are infiltrated by radical elements that are seeking to harm Australians, then I think we really need to react against that and do so in a way that completely keeps freedom of speech available to people, but holds people to account when they're using these platforms to rally for more violent causes. So I think technologically, we need to increase our level of surveillance on those on the watch list. One of these gentlemen who undertook this attack was assessed by one of our domestic intelligence agencies. His father had multiple firearms and was on a visa to Australia, and clearly had extremist views and attended extremist mosques and telegraphed those views quite publicly. He should have been caught. We should be matching extremist content online to the people that are saying it in Australia. And if they're on visas, they should be out. And if they're not on visas and they're Australians, they should be held accountable for our expectations on them as citizens and sent to prison for their extreme positions.
Robert Potter, it's been a pleasure. Thank you very much for speaking to us on Focal Length. And with that, it is a wrap on this episode. For more international news and updates, stay tuned on NewsX World.